Hey, everyone. Yeah, so that was a great introduction, and I hope that this will be useful for everybody. So, you have a case, you're working on a case, and let's say you have a really important question, right? The outcome or the answer to this question is going to determine the outcome of your case, right? That's going to have consequences, maybe for an individual, maybe for the company that you work for or you're representing. And you really want to make sure you get the answer to this question right. Maybe you're feeling pretty good. Maybe you've answered this question a bunch of times before and you think you got a pretty good plan. Maybe you've answered this question before, but it was, I don't know, 15, 20 cases ago, and what you did is a little bit fuzzy, not quite as clear. Maybe you've answered this question before, or a related question before, but now this time there's different technology involved, like stuff's always changing, right? So you have a different stack if you're doing it in a different cloud. So you're kind of familiar, but a lot of the technical parts are different. Or maybe you've never had to answer this question before and you're not quite sure where to start. But then you're thinking, oh, who would know how to answer this question? My colleague over in Australia. But she's asleep right now, so I can't even like virtually, tap her on the shoulder and ask what she would do.
Because expertise is distributed everywhere. Diana might be your AI ML expert, but she's in Zurich. Ollie might know everything there is to know about cloud, but he's in Sydney. Ryan is your web forensic expert, but he's on vacation. It's impossible to keep up with it all. There's so many deep technical expertise that we have to know. We just heard a 35-minute talk about email forensics. I don't know anything he just said, full disclosure. It's everywhere, right? It's so deep and it's really hard to know everything all at once. And your exec, your legal, your customer, they want answers right now. Where do you start? Even more importantly, you have an incident. It's going on right now. And you need to hand off that incident to the next person who's on call. What did you ask? What were the problems that you solved during your shift? How do you convey what you answered and what questions you asked in a way that can be standard and universal, that everybody understands what you just did and why you did it? Conveying those technical requests up and laterally is really difficult, and we don't have a good standard around it. So to tackle that.
Yeah, and even if you have answered the question, one thing not worse, but it's almost as bad as getting the question wrong is you're answering the wrong question, right? Somebody thinks they asked one thing and you answer a different thing. There's a lot of problems with communication. And so, yeah, we have this thing called DFIQ that we're introducing today. So as Phil said, DFIQ stands for Digital Forensics Investigative Questions. And basically what it is, it's a collection of questions and how you would answer them, how you would approach answering them. There's a lot more parts to it than that, but I kind of want to focus on three aspects to kind of just convey the gist of what DFIQ is. And like I said, at the core, it is a catalog of investigative knowledge centered on questions, right? Because I mean, as investigators, that's what we do. We ask questions all the time, right? Like Armand was saying, like, when was this email created? When was it forwarded? What services are running on this computer? What service accounts are configured with access to this cloud bucket? Like, all we do is ask questions. And some of those questions are even bigger, right? Investigations are basically questions. Is this host compromised? What did the attacker take? Is this employee stealing trade secrets from us? Like, those are questions. They're a lot bigger questions and they're kind of messy, and it's a lot harder to get a definitive answer to them. But that's why DFIQ has another kind of concept, and we have a way to kind of deconstruct these big ambiguous questions into smaller, a lot more tractable questions so we can get good answers to. And then again, we want DFIQ to be helpful for everybody, right? We're all on the same team. We're on the blue team, most of us, right? And so we want this to be useful for everybody, for both computers and for people. And so we store this investigative catalog in a tool agnostic kind of a YAML files, basically, so we can consume it everywhere. Okay, so that's kind of describing what it is, but why should we do this? And I think the number one reason is consistency. This is the thing that comes up a lot when you're doing cases. And for me, like, I want to make sure that I'm answering the question the best way every time, right? And I want to, hopefully that best way is the same way. Hopefully I'm doing it the same way every time. And if the best way changes, I can evolve with that and keep doing it the same best way every time. And I want that for the rest of my team too. I want everyone to do it the best way, the same way every time. It's also really important if you're, depending on where you're doing your investigations, is who's going to be challenging your work, right? Is it opposing counsel? Is it another expert? Is it just your manager? I mean, even though all those things, like if you have a really consistent approach, it's a lot more defensible in whatever realm you're in. So having that is another really good way of making sure you kind of think out what you're doing and doing it the same way every time. That also ties right into kind of like what I call explainability, right? A lot of times you're working on a case and somebody's like, hey, so why did you do that? Or why didn't you do that? If you have a standard kind of, not a script, but you have a standard menu of questions that you ask, a standard way you do things with a lot of thought into it, there's no thing saying you can't add a new question to it, but at least you have a standard that you start from. So it's a good way to explain kind of why you're doing what you're doing. Another concept that's not new in DFIR is like, not even in tech really, is there's a thing called like T-shaped people, right? A lot of people have most people have very broad knowledge, but it's kind of shallow. And there's a few areas that they're really deep in, right? And forensics is expanding. There's so many domains. It's very hard, almost impossible to be very deep in all of them, right? But we want to really have thorough investigations, right? We want to go as deep, we want to go as broad as we can on investigations and as deep as we can. And so having kind of centralized place where you track all this knowledge and have it at the analyst's fingertips is really important to have like kind of the best answers to the questions that we can.
We want to lower that barrier to entry. Yesterday, when they asked how many people were here for the first time, it was quite a few hands, right? My hand included, honestly, because the barrier to entry into forensic investigations is quite high. Knowing everything, when to ask it, how to get there is hard. So how can I take the questions and the knowledge that's in a senior analyst who's been doing this for 10 or 15 or 20 years and take that over to a junior analyst, or even from a senior analyst to another senior analyst who may not be, again, an email expert or a web expert or a cloud expert. Having this barrier to entry lowered for everybody across the board to have those right questions, maybe not have all the answers, but to know the right questions to ask and when is tremendously valuable. We want to enable that team knowledge sharing. In every company that I've ever been in, sharing knowledge from across and through the silos is tremendously difficult. Making sure that you have, again, that body of knowledge that can be shared. We're on the same boat. We're going in the same direction. How can we all better make ourselves better defensible and a stronger organization? We want to increase that clarity of those questions, of that knowledge, and that portability, not even sharing within our own silos in our company, but as an industry.
And one of the things well beyond just forensics in this industry is like communication is key to pretty much everything, right? It's a problem in every aspect of life. Communication can always be better. And one of the things that I've been really impressed with is how like MITRE ATT&CK has done it's given us like a shared language to talk about what attackers do, what steps they did, where they are in their life cycle. It's a very nice, it's very concise way to describe these complicated, complex technical topics. And that's my dream for DFIQ is that DFIQ can be that, but for like investigative steps, right? When you're saying, oh, I did whatever this is, like you can refer to it as an ID and we can really like talk the same language and not have a lot of miscommunications. So that was a whole lot of stuff about DFIQ, what it is, why you should like it. But we don't have the time to go through all those things. So we're going to focus on two main things today. The first thing, like I said, it's a catalog of questions. So I really want to spend a lot of time explaining what I mean by a question. And also part of that, what is an approach? That's how you answer the questions. That's kind of the first part today. And the second part is, like I said, not all questions are the same. Some are big, some are small. And so DFIQ breaks the big questions into the small ones and it kind of organizes them. And so that's what we want to talk about in the second part. So the core of DFIQ is the question, right? We ask questions all the time. And like DFIQ is definitely not the first and it probably won't be the last attempt at managing knowledge in the forensic space, right? And when there's a few different schools of thought about this, kind of like a spectrum where you have on one end, you might take a class or a book or whatever, and you just try to become like a domain expert on a particular like technology or class of artifacts. Like I want to know everything I can know about the Windows registry, right? You have all this knowledge and then you take it and you're just supposed to apply like what you know in your head to the case that you're working on, right? Just do the appropriate things because you know how the thing works. And so that definitely has strengths and a lot of people operate that way. And the other end of the spectrum is that like you have a very prescriptive, checklists get a bad rap, but like a very prescriptive thing where it's like, go run this tool, the command is this, take the output, filter it, go to line 57, take the so it's so prescriptive that it's gonna be super brittle and it's not gonna work very long. And honestly, the analyst isn't really thinking. And if you can write it out that precisely, you just make it a script and forget about it, right? It shouldn't be an analyst anyway. And so I think questions are kind of the middle ground, right? That it takes a lot of knowledge and applies it and kind of encapsulates it in a way that you can apply it in a lot of different kind of situations. So again, I like examples, so let's just switch over to talk about an example. So here's a question. What files were downloaded using a web browser? So that's a question. When I started this project, thinking of the questions turned out to be a lot harder than I thought it would be, right? Because questions are easy to say, right? But one of the things with DFIQ is that we want the questions to be specific enough that I can give you an answer, like these 5 files were downloaded, or the answer is yes or no, or 42. But we don't want to be so specific that we can't reuse them, right? Because what files are downloaded through a web browser, you could use that if you're investigating like an email case, right? If they use a web client, download an email attachment, you want to know that's downloaded through a web browser. It could be from a malware case, right? Did an attacker download something, or a drive-by download from a web browser? So basically this question, you can use this question in multiple different places, as long as we kind of package it in this kind of way. And in DFIQ, the question is pretty simple. It's like, there's a question, what files are downloaded using a web browser? And you have a little bit of metadata. Like I mentioned, we have some IDs that you kind of, so you can concisely kind of refer to this question. We have some tags, but that's really it. The main kind of like the meat of this, the superpower, is the approaches, right? So this is the same question, what files were downloaded using a web browser? But now we have 3 different approaches in how you could answer this question, right? There's almost always more than one way to do something, right? And if you're on that question, that's super important. I would want to get the answer in as many ways as I can and make sure they all say the same thing, right? If they don't, then that's a whole separate problem that you still want to know about. We got to kind of dig into more. So the first approach here is like you want to maybe collect download records from local browser artifacts, right? This is probably what I think most people would think of, right? Looking at a web browser, grab whatever local DB it is and pull out the download records. I think that's pretty straightforward. I think most people would kind of go that route. But that's certainly not the only way you could approach answering this question, right? If you're looking at like a Chrome or Chromium-based browser, if you do a file download, it's going to create a particular pattern or signature on the file system of different file system actions it does. So you can detect file downloads that way. So the second approach is using something like a file system event logs. If you have like an agent, like if you're on Mac, we have Santa, it's an open source agent, or another EDR client. If it records file kind of activity, you could figure out what was downloaded through the web browser that way. The third one is the same thing, but using the same pattern, but looking at it through maybe like USN change journal records, right? You could find what was downloaded in lots of different ways. And there's certainly more approaches than just these 3. So again, let's kind of, I want to dig into like how that approach is structured in DFIQ, because I think it's kind of important to understand how this can work. So the first part is the metadata. So this is again like the kind of stuff we just talked about, the name of the approach, maybe some tags, some IDs. It's not super important right now. The second part is the explanation. So this is kind of like what I just did to y'all right now. I kind of said in a couple of sentences what I meant by this approach, how this approach could help answer the question. So it's not an essay. It has a room for references, right? So if there's a really good resource on like Forensics Wiki or Sans video or something like that, you just put it in there as a reference. And if someone wants to dig deeper, they can go somewhere else. Another anti-goal of DFIQ is I don't want to duplicate everybody else's knowledge, right? I want to have just the core stuff that's important and linked everywhere else. And the third part here is what I call the notes section. And this is something that I think might be overlooked, but I think is kind of critically important, especially as we deal with analysts that have different skill levels. Also, not even skill levels, different backgrounds, right? This is the whole T-shaped people thing. Everybody comes into investigation with their own experiences, their own biases, their own things they're most comfortable with. And so they also come with a lot of implicit knowledge, right? So they know that this thing will work or this thing won't. And they kind of like, assume that everybody, they don't think about it. They assume that everybody else knows this one little gotcha or something, right? But they don't, right? And we don't know all those things. This is a section in the approach to explicitly state out the things that are otherwise left to the reader to kind of like understand, right? So like in this example, like what files are downloaded, like I've done a lot of web browser stuff. I'm going to know that if somebody's using incognito, it's probably not going to appear in the download database, right? I know it's not, so I wouldn't even look there, right? But someone newer might not know that because the approach says just look here, right? So explicitly writing these things again helps make things more clear and reduce ambiguity. So this part of the approach, this is the last 3 parts, I promise. This describes kind of how you actually answer the question. And so how this works is that you basically have data and it flows into a processor and the processor flows into the analysis section. And like I said, we don't want to, DFIQ doesn't want to like be super, it doesn't want to define things that's already defined somewhere else. And it's like in the data section, There's already an external project called Forensic Artifacts, right? So it's a very nice way to describe all the different ways in file paths and whatnot where different artifacts can be. So a lot of, you might, for the data section, you might just describe, use this forensic artifact as a way to collect the information that you're going to need. It could also be, we've seen a lot of really good talks about different cloud forensics things. So maybe it's a query to pull back some GCP or Azure logs. It's how you get the data you need. It's not actually the data, but it's how you would, the key information you need to get the data. So then once you have the raw data, then you have a processor. So processor takes the raw information and processes it into a bunch of structured information. So a good example of a processor would be like log to timeline, right? If you use the data and you get a bunch of prefetch files, the data definition is how you pull prefetch files. You stick it into log to timeline and you get a giant timeline with a bunch of stuff, right? That's where you get to the analysis section, because the analysis, if you ever use log to timeline, you're probably familiar with, multi-100,000 or million row spreadsheets, which is great, but that's not the answer. The answer is like 5 particular lines that you care about, right? So the analysis section is how you go from this massive amount of process information to just the very specific information that actually answers your question. And not all approaches are as 1, 2, 3 as this, as data processor analysis. Some might just have data. If you have like just a log query that's super tight and just gives you the answer, maybe that's one way. Some approaches will have one data definition and multiple processor analysis pairs, because you can use multiple ways to process raw data to get to the same answer, right? You have a open source tool, you have a commercial suite, you have a script somewhere. So all those things are kind of supported within DFIQ. And so I just give you a lot of talks about concepts and things, but this is something a little more tangible. So this is a way to, this is like a website version of taking those raw YAML files and formatting it for kind of human consumption, right? And so this is basically talking about, this is like the metadata type section. It has the name of the question, the ID, and a little summary of like how the different answers, how you would approach answering the question. And there's like some links on the side if you want to jump to either any of those sections, like the data section, the analysis section that I talked about. So again, this is just like scrolling down the page. I know you can't read it that well, but I'll just send you the link afterwards. So explanation, right? It's the 2 sentences explaining the key parts of this approach. If there's longer form information, like if you really want to learn about web browser downloads, go to look at the Forensic Wiki. If you want to look at an artifact definition, check this out, kind of thing. And then the notes section explicitly saying this approach covers these cases. It does not cover these cases, right? So this is talking about the web browser downloads through checking it through local artifacts. Like if you use the forensic artifact definition to pull the files, if the Chrome's installed in a non-standard location, it's not going to get it. So writing that out there is a good thing to make sure that we cover all those bases. And then this is just the last 3 that I talked about. Just describing the data, how you're linking out to the artifact. You can not including the artifact here, but linking out to a different place to get it. The processor, like this one, for processing local artifacts, you could use Plazo or you could use Hindsight. They both could process the same raw information and give you pretty much the same answer, the same processed, same structured data. And then you can analyze it to get just to your answer. So I've kind of alluded a little bit about things that DFIQ doesn't do. And I think the balance of what's included and what's not is kind of important. In past jobs, I've worked with or worked on building like SOAR products, right? I don't want to go back into that business again, right? We want to tell you, DFIQ should tell you just the core information you need and not the extra stuff that's going to be super specific to your environment, right? So from this perspective, I'm going to tell you what data you need, but you can figure out how to get it, right? DFIQ is not a replacement for analysts. It's trying to help you get this information. So whether you're going to go pull stuff from a disk image or you're going to use some EDR agent to get files or whatever you're going to do, that's between you and kind of your enterprise. So you can figure that out, right? That seems like a logical separation. Kind of in the same way, like I'll tell you what programs can process that raw information, or DFIQ will tell you that. But I'm not going to tell you how to run the program, right? So I'll tell you can process this with log to timeline. I'm not going to tell you how to install log to timeline. I don't know if anybody can tell you how to install log to timeline, but I mean, it's sorry, rest of my team. But yeah, so like that's kind of like the differentiator here, right? And the same thing for the analysis. I'll tell you what steps you need to do. I'm not going to tell you how to take the file and load it into TimeSketch or Elasticsearch or wherever you're doing your analysis, right? That's something that you know better than me.
As we said, not all questions are the same, right? There's some that are hard to ask, easy to answer, some that are easy to ask, hard to answer, some are big, some are small, some are ambiguous, some don't make any sense, some are coming from legal, some are coming from executives, and some have a lot of pressure, right? And we want to be able to organize these things. The investigations are questions too, as Ryan said, right? So it's not just the tactical, it can be the big as well. So we need a way that we can break down these big questions to effectively answer them. So we need to organize these questions. I'm going to spend a minute on this slide because it's a little bit to break down. And I'm going to set this down because we're going to start up here because I talk with my hands. We start up here with this big scenario, this really big question, right? Did the user bring any external IP to our company? Now, there's a lot of different ways that that could happen. There's a lot of different facets to this question, to this scenario. So to answer that question, we have yet another question. So I'm going to hold the scenario literally in my hand, and I'm going to look at it this way, right? And one of the ways that this could happen was they could introduce it via downloading. But if you turn it just a little bit, you could also come in through a thick client like Slack or OneDrive, right? A downloaded client that it is downloading, but it's a different way that it could come onto the machine. So it's the same high level question, but there's many different ways you can answer that question. So those are the facets. Those are the things where if you turn that question on the side, that's what it ends up looking at. So let's look at the specific facet of downloading, right? So there's other questions that we need to ask ourselves to answer this question. Were they downloaded through a browser, right? How did they get onto the machine, right? So I kind of jumped to the thick client, but at the facets also, you could bring in through USB drives. You could physically print out blueprints if you work for an architecture firm. There's lots of different ways that it could come into the company. So the question to answer this specific facet was those thick clients. Was it a web browser, right? And the approaches to answer that question could be what we've already described, right? File system journal records for downloads, local browser artifacts for downloads. So this is the way that we're trying to organize these questions. And we're using these words really intentionally to make sure that we have a body of common language that we can get on the same boat and start talking to each other. So that way we have the appropriate information at the appropriate time and start sharing this information with one another. Now, I'm up here because Ryan does not pray to the demo gods like I do. And I was told that I'm not allowed to do a live demo, and I'm not going to because I'm not that crazy. But we do want to show you what this might look like in practice. And we're going to do that through TimeSketch. For those of you not familiar with TimeSketch, TimeSketch is an open source data analysis tool that analysts can use to do timeline analysis and collaboratively share those sketches with one another. You can upload files to it like Plazo, CSV, JSON, and those are stored inside of OpenSearch. So that way the analyst can dig through and understand what's happening. They can annotate it. They can start pulling things apart and again, share it with one another. Now, I'm going to do this in GIF form, so it's going to move whether I move or not. So bear with me, and I'm going to try to go along with it. So what we're going to start with is we're going to log into TimeSketch. And as we log into TimeSketch, we're going to see a new tab called Investigate. In that Investigate tab, we're going to be able to select scenarios. There's 4 different scenarios that we have pre-populated into this version of TimeSketch. We're going to start with a basic triage. That basic system triage is probably where we're all going to start, right? We just want to understand what's happening. We can make a copy, we can hide it, we can rename it if we don't like basic triage. But we're going to start with system information. That seems like a logical place to start when you're doing an investigation. In system information, this is where that starts to get really powerful because you see the high-level scenario of basic triage, then we see the facet of system information, and then the specific question of what version of operating system is running. And this is where it starts to get really powerful. We select this pre-populated query that we don't have to memorize, and it's giving us these Windows key event logs. I don't need to know the event ID. I can start filtering based on which domain controller is happening, and I can start looking into it. So as we look into this, and as we look into this event log, we can see that it's Windows 2012 R2 server. Again, we're not taking away the analyst from this. We're not doing the analyst job for them. We are accelerating them and 10xing them, right? They don't have to have all this memorized. We can also add in a conclusion. As we add in the conclusion, other analysts who are on this sketch with me can now see that I have asked this basic question, which is something that we should start with, and add it in so that way when they jump on this sketch, as I hand this over on my on-call shift, they already know what questions I asked and what answers I got for them. Pretty powerful stuff. But there's more to it than just system information. What about account changes? What about things that are a little bit more difficult to find? Yet again, we're seeing a very difficult query that I'm not going to have memorized, certainly not going to have memorized, and may not even have the best version of, because Ryan's much better at OpenSearch than I am. and he's already pre-populated this for me. This is awesome. So I don't need to remember this, but I do need to know how to dig into these event logs. As I'm digging in, I can see things and I can favorite them for the analyst coming up next to view. How powerful is that, right? We're now sharing this knowledge. We can also look into lateral movement. Lateral movement seems to be probably a bigger question. So we're going to add that in as a scenario, right? As a scenario, because it could be Windows, it could be Unix, it could be network. There's a lot of different ways that we can do the lateral movement. Obviously, in this scenario, we're looking at Windows. One of the ways that we're doing that is through remote access, through RDP. That seems common, right? That makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of ways that we can answer this question, though, a lot of approaches. We're going to look at just successful logins, though, because that's an easy query that's already pre-populated. And that's something that I'm familiar with and feel comfortable with. I'm going to look at these event logs and I'm going to star, I'm going to favorite, I'm going to annotate some things that maybe look a little suspicious that I want to come back to later. But I'm a visual person. I'm looking at these in a linear fashion, just on a spreadsheet. It's a little confusing. One of the powerful things in TimeSketch that you're able to do is you're able to look at it in graph view. It's fully interactive. So you can select a user, you can select a machine and see what they were connecting into, which gives us a nice visual artifact that we can dig around and play with. Again, super powerful. We can annotate these things as well. That way we can share it with Brian when he comes on his on-call shift. We can compress this down so we don't have to look at all that busyness either. So let's keep going. We see that there's a system, we see there's lateral movement, there's probably persistence too, right? Yet again, lots of different persistence mechanisms that could exist out there. So we're going to go in and we're going to add this as a scenario, but I'm new to persistence. I don't know exactly how this works. What are some questions that I can ask? Well, what about piped activity? That seems like a common way that this happens, but I don't know the query. Thankfully, the event ID doesn't need to be remembered by me and neither does the query. I'm able to kind of dig through these logs as a junior analyst. I'm able to visualize it because I'm a visual person yet again. I'm able to select this specific user and see that this doesn't look right. Yet again, super powerful. What a great way to start pulling these things apart. And as we go through these, we can have that consistent approach that we were talking about, right? We can be running the same queries. We can be updating those queries as we go, and we can be sharing this knowledge from a senior analyst down to a junior analyst, to somebody who's new to this field because they just don't know, right? It's tremendously powerful, and that's why we're putting together a DFIQ, and we want everybody to join in this journey with us.
Yeah, so what we've talked about so far, mostly when I'm saying DFIQ, like the knowledge base, like I said, it's this collection of kind of like tool agnostic YAML files, right? So it's any kind of tool can read it, any person can read it. But it's not super useful in that form, right? It's designed to be consumed by things. So I showed you some screenshots of a website that's called DFIQ.org. It has the questions and the approaches and all the scenarios and the facets that we've talked about, kind of in a way that's rendered for people, kind of like a wiki almost. John just showed you TimeSketch, right? So that's a way of tool reading consuming those same YAML files and using it, adding its own spin on it, right? And then adding it into a way that you consume inside of a tool. I like Python notebooks, whether it's Jupyter or Colab. So I do a lot of stuff in there. I'm not quite there yet. A lot of stuff happened at work, but there's some DFIQ things you can import into notebooks, and then we can kind of use DFIQ in a more programmatic sense to answer these questions. But these other two ones on here, I'm particularly excited about, right? Like your tool, do you want to build something with this? We saw a lot of great presentations the past couple of days, asked a lot of questions. I saw a lot of queries for cloud logs and stuff in there. Like, I'm not going to remember that, and I don't think you should have to remember it either, right? So if we kind of write it down, make a question out of it, and make an approach to answer the question, I think it could be a really powerful way. And maybe you want to build a tool that does something different. Maybe it has a flashy GUI. Maybe it's, I don't know. If you want to use it as a way to say, okay, I have these questions, what data artifacts can answer these questions? And I'll maybe build a tool to go use Cape or something to pull back these artifacts and answer the question. Like whatever you guys want to do, it'd be awesome. The last one on here I have is your internal site. One of the things that I didn't really talk about because we didn't have time is that I thought about DFIQ about how we'd use it internally, right? And maybe there's some questions you have that you're not ready to share with the world, right? It uses some proprietary whatever, or it just wouldn't apply to any company but yours. We have something inside DFIQ, kind of like almost like a private IP address space. We have like a private ID space where we have support where you can have your own questions with your own IDs that won't collide with anybody else's. So you very easily pull in all the public stuff from the GitHub repo. and also have your own private stuff in there and kind of have them work seamlessly, right? So host a site internally that has all this stuff kind of together. So I forgot to mention that part. So all this stuff we talked about, it's on, we just posted on GitHub. So github.com/Google/DFIQ. That's where all this is. And yeah, I'm very excited to share this with everybody. I think Phil kind of mentioned a little bit, if you're newer to DFIR, sometimes making a whole giant tool or making a whole research paper or a talk might be a bit daunting. But if you have one area that you've spent a lot of time in, you want to research, and you say, hey, I know this one question like really well, and I know 3 ways to answer it, even 1 way to answer it. Making a DFIQ question and approach, it's like I said, it's just YAML files. I don't have a lot of developer docs up there yet, but that will come soon, I promise. But anyway, making something like that is a very tangible, very chunkable thing that you can do and contribute back to the community kind of in a meaningful way. And I'm very excited to see what we all will do with this.
Thank you.
Thanks.